He almost didn't stop. Steve McQueen had been on the road since 4 in the morning, moving through the California backcountry on a motorcycle with no destination and no schedule. He had told no one where he was going. He had not planned where he would sleep. He was running not from anything criminal, not from anything dramatic, just from the particular exhaustion of being a public man for too long without a break. 3 weeks of filming, 2 weeks of press, 1 week of contracts and lawyers and people who needed things from him constantly. He needed road. He needed silence. He needed to be nobody for a few days. That was all. He was doing 60 on Route 9 through Ridge Hollow, California, and he had already decided to stop for gas in the next town when the chrome caught the light. It was a flash, maybe half a mile ahead, coming from behind a chain-link fence beside a collapsed gas station. The afternoon sun hit it at exactly the right angle, and for just a second, something reflected back at him like a signal. He let off the throttle. He did not know why. A mechanic's instinct, maybe. Or something else, the particular feeling of a man who has spent his life being drawn toward machines that other men have given up on. He pulled to the gravel shoulder and cut the engine. The Harley-Davidson Hydroglide was chained to the fence with a heavy loop of steel secured by a padlock roughly the size of a man's fist. The machine was covered in years of Central Valley dust. The chrome had oxidized, the leather seat had cracked and curled at the edges. One mirror was gone, the other was tilted toward the sky, as if trying to catch something passing overhead. The whole machine looked like it had been there for a decade. But 2 things stopped Steve from moving on. The first, the padlock was clean, not polished, just clean, recently wiped and freshly oiled. Someone had been here not long ago, doing exactly that one task and nothing else. The second, the gas tank had been wiped down. Just the tank. Everything around it was gray with grime. The tank itself showed a faint stripe of original paint, dark green, almost black where someone had drawn a cloth across it, as if they needed to see the color one more time. As if they were saying goodbye repeatedly, once a week, year after year. Steve stood there reading the machine. He had ridden enough motorcycles to know the difference between a machine that had been abandoned and a machine that had been placed. This one had been placed. Every detail, the careful loop of the chain, the angle of the front wheel, the precise position of the bike against the post said so. Then he crouched beside the handlebar. There was a placard, small, metal, screwed to the grip, with 2 short bolts. The letters had been stamped into the metal, not painted, not written, which was why they were still fully readable after 11 years of sun and rain. "Do not move," he promised. Steve read it once. Then again, he stood up slowly and looked at the gas station. The windows were boarded over. The front door was padlocked. The corrugated roof sagged on one side. Nothing should have been moving. But one of the plywood boards on the far left window, the one closest to the fence, shifted. Not much. Just slightly inward. The way a board moves when the weight behind it changes, as if someone had been leaning against it and had just stepped back. Steve did not move. He kept his eyes on the board. It did not move again. He looked at the ground near the building's side wall. Dry dust. No wind. He looked at the road, empty in both directions. He looked back at the board. Whoever had been there was gone now, or was standing very still and waiting for him to leave first. Steve looked at the placard one more time. Then he put his helmet on, walked to his motorcycle without rushing, and rode the 200 yards to the Ridge Hollow diner. He didn't know it yet, but someone in that town had just watched him read a message that was 11 years old and was already moving to report it. The diner smelled like coffee and warm pie, and something harder to name the particular atmosphere of a place where people come not just to eat, but to be near other people, because the alternative is being alone. Steve sat at the counter. 4 stools, black and white tile floor worn pale in the walking paths, a jukebox playing something slow and country near the window. He set his helmet on the stool beside him and waited. The woman who came from the back was in her early 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back and the posture of someone who had spent decades carrying things. Her face was open, but the openness was careful, the face of a woman who had learned to measure strangers before deciding how much of herself to give them. Her name tag said Martha. She set a white mug in front of him and filled it without being asked. "Menus on the board," she said. "Thank you." Steve wrapped both hands around the mug. "Can I ask you something first?" "Depends on what it is." The Harley chained to the fence behind the old gas station down the road. "Who put it there?" Martha's hand stopped moving. The coffee pot stayed in the air between them. not going up or down, just suspended. It was the kind of stillness that is not calm. It is the stillness of someone who has been waiting for a question they are not sure they are ready to answer. She set the pot down. She picked up a cloth from beside the register and began wiping the counter slowly, the way she always did when her hands needed something to do so the rest of her could think. "Man named Walt Maddox," she said. "He passed away 8 months ago. Before he died, he asked me to keep that padlock oiled. You've been going down there?" "Every week." She did not look up from the counter. Rain or shine, people in this town thought I was as strange as he was. There was something in the way she said it. Not pride, not resentment, just the particular exhaustion of a woman who had done the right small thing for a long time while knowing the right large thing was still waiting. "Did he tell you why he chained it there?" She looked at him, then really looked at him, the way you look at a person before you decide to hand them something fragile. Walt's best friend was a man named Daniel Kerrigan. Daniel was accused of something serious in 1957. He ran before charges were filed. This town decided that meant he was guilty. She paused. Walt never believed it. He said Daniel left the Harley behind on purpose, said there was something hidden inside it that would tell the truth if someone ever opened it. He just couldn't find it before he got too sick. "And you?" Steve said. "Did you believe Walt?" Martha set down the cloth. She looked at the counter. "I believed him," she said quietly. "I oiled that lock every week for 8 months. But I never once went to the county office. I never called a lawyer. I never pushed." She exhaled slowly. "I told myself I was protecting the lock for the right person to come along, but the truth is I was afraid of Calvin Rusk. And Walt died waiting for someone braver than me to walk through that door." She said it without self-pity. Just the plain, unvarnished shape of a guilt she had been living with and had finally decided to tell the truth about. Before Steve could respond, the door behind him opened, and the room changed temperature. Calvin Rusk was not a man who raised his voice. He had never needed to. He was large and deliberate, moving through the diner the way a man moves through a space he has always owned without checking whether anyone was looking, because they always were. His uniform was pressed. His badge caught the light from the doorway and held it a moment longer than it should have. His pale blue eyes went around the room once, the way a man reads a room he already knows by heart, and then settled on the stranger at the counter. He took the stool 2 down from Steve. Martha poured his coffee before he asked. He did not thank her. "Saw a motorcycle outside I didn't recognize," he said, conversational, unhurried. "You passing through?" "That's the plan," Steve said. "What brings you out this way?" "Not much on Route 9 that draws people. Just riding." "Uh-huh." Rusk turned his mug once in a slow circle. "You been down the road any? See anything that caught your eye?" The pause Steve took was short enough to mean nothing and long enough to mean something. "Old gas station," he said. "Looks like it's been closed a long time. Ellis Stroud's property. He's clearing it out. Junk haulers coming Thursday." Rusk said it like a man reading from a schedule he had already confirmed twice. "There's an old motorcycle chained to the fence back there. Belonged to a man named Walt Maddox who passed earlier this year. Walt was a good man. Grief does strange things to people, though. He spent the last decade convinced his old friend was coming back to settle something, left that bike chained to a fence like a monument." He shook his head, an expression of practiced sympathy. "Nothing inside it, nothing waiting. Just an old machine and an old man who couldn't let go." "The padlock's been oiled recently," Steve said. Rusk turned and looked at him directly for the first time. "Martha oiled it," he said, as a kindness to Walt's memory. He let that sit for a moment, making sure it landed the way he intended, a soft explanation with a harder edge underneath. "But the property belongs to Ellis now, legally, and come Thursday it all goes." Another pause. "Better to let some things rest." He said it calmly, like a man who has said a version of this sentence many times over many years and has found it effective. Steve said nothing. Rusk drank his coffee, left $2 on the counter for a cup that cost a dime, and stood. "If you're staying the night, the motor court on the south end is decent. If you're just passing through, the interstate is about 40 minutes east." He put on his hat. "Enjoy the ride." He walked out. Steve watched through the window as the cruiser pulled onto the road, turning away from the gas station, not toward it. A man with nothing to hide goes past the thing on his way out of town. A man with something to hide goes the other way. He turned back to Martha. "How long has he been doing that?" he asked. Coming in, every time someone mentions the Harley, Martha was already wiping the counter. 11 years, she said, give or take. Noah Whitlock came in through the back door about 20 minutes later, moving quietly, the way he always moved when he suspected Rusk might still be nearby. He was 17, tall, with dark eyes that missed nothing, and hands that were never quite clean despite how hard he scrubbed them at the end of a shift. He wore a gray t-shirt with a tear at the shoulder and work boots resoled by a man who knew how to make things last. He looked at Steve the way young people look at strangers they have decided to trust before they have finished deciding. You're the one asking about the Harley, he said. I am. He sat down 2 stools away and put both hands flat on the counter. Martha set a glass of water in front of him without comment. My dad used to walk me past it when I was little, he said. He'd say, see that man Noah? That's Walt Maddox. He's the most loyal man in this county, and everybody treats him like he's crazy. And then he'd walk me home and not say anything else about it. He turned the water glass in a slow circle. My dad died when I was 12. After that, I started going past the Harley on my own, every morning on the way to work, just to look at it. Why? Noah was quiet for a moment. Then, because every adult I knew had decided to stop looking. The sheriff told them it was nothing, and they believed him. The bank manager believed him. The reverend believed him. The men at the garage believed him. He looked up. And I kept thinking, what if Walt was right, and all of them were wrong? What if the reason nobody looked was because looking meant admitting they should have looked years ago? He said it without heat, just the flat observation of a kid who had spent 5 years watching adults teach each other to look away from uncomfortable things. Walt talked to me his last winter, Noah continued. He was getting weak, and he knew it. He told me Daniel had hidden something inside the headlight. He said, Noah, that proof has been sitting in that machine for 11 years. I can't find it, and my hands are no good anymore. But someone's going to come along one of these days. Make sure they don't give up. Steve looked at him steadily. And you've been waiting for that person. Every morning, Noah said. Every morning for 2 years. He glanced toward the front window, the old habit of a boy who had been warned about the sheriff one too many times. Thursday's 4 days away, he said. That junk hauler takes the Harley and it's over. Whatever's in that headlight goes into a crusher somewhere and nobody ever knows. Steve picked up his helmet from the stool beside him. Tell me something, he said. The headlight housing, you know, the configuration on a Hydra-Glide? Noah almost smiled. I've been staring at that headlight for 5 years. I know every scratch on the retaining ring. I know one screw is missing and the other 3 aren't flush. He paused. Someone opened it in a hurry. They put it back, but they didn't finish. Steve stood up. Don't touch the fence, he said. Not yet. Noah's eyes followed him to the door. But you're coming back, he said. It was not a question. Steve didn't answer. But he didn't deny it, either. Steve went back to the gas station. He parked on the shoulder and stood outside the fence again, this time looking at the headlight. The sun was lower now, hitting the chrome ring from a flat angle that showed the details clearly. 3 screws, seated but not flush, 1 missing, a gap at the upper left side of the ring, just wide enough to tell you it had been opened and closed again by someone who was running out of time. He looked at the padlock, heavy, well-maintained, but the chain running through it looped the fork to the post and back again, not bolted to the fence, not welded to anything structural. With the right key, the chain would simply pull free. The motorcycle could roll away in under a minute. So, where was the key? He drove back to the diner. Martha was closing up the last table when he walked in. She looked at his face and seemed to understand something before he spoke. She reached under the counter and brought out a small tin box, the kind sold at hardware stores for storing nails and bolts. Dented on one corner, a strip of masking tape across the lid with Walt written in black marker. She set it between them. He left this with me 8 months ago, she said. His exact words were, if anyone ever comes in asking the right questions about that Harley, Martha, you give them this. Not to the sheriff, not to Ellis, to whoever asks the right questions. He knew someone would come. He hoped. Her voice was very quiet. He didn't know. There's a difference. She looked at the tin. I've been carrying this around every day for 8 months. Even brought it to work. Couldn't leave it at home, felt like leaving Walt behind all over again. Steve opened the box. Inside, a Veterans Administration card in Walt Maddox's name. A sealed envelope addressed to no one, just the words, "For whatever comes," written across the front in Walt's deliberate, slightly unsteady hand. A photograph, folded once. And a key heavy, clean, unmistakably cut for the lock on that chain. He picked up the photograph first. Two young men in military fatigues, squinting into strong sunlight. One of them stood with his hand flat on the Hydroglide's tank, the same tank that had been wiped clean every week for 11 years, laughing at something out of frame. Open, careless, not yet knowing what was coming. The other looked directly into the camera. Not smiling exactly, more like a man making a silent declaration. The look of someone who has decided something and needs a witness, even if the witness is only a lens. On the back, in faded pencil, Walt and Danny, 1952. Before it all went wrong, Steve looked at that second face for a long moment. The man who had made a promise and kept it for 11 years without being certain the promise would ever matter. The man who had died alone beside a fence in a small town, while the person he was protecting was somewhere out there, erased. He put the photograph in his jacket pocket and picked up the sealed letter. He would read it tonight, alone, under the motor court lamp. "But first, Martha," he said, "did Walt ever tell you what he thought was inside the headlight?" He said Daniel left proof that what happened at Red Creek wasn't an accident, and that the man who covered it up was still walking around this county wearing a badge. The light was almost gone now outside the diner window. The road was empty. Somewhere 200 yards away, the padlock on the Hydroglide was sitting in the last of the afternoon heat, patient as it had been patient for 11 years. Steve put the key in his jacket pocket next to the photograph. "Lock the front door when I leave," he said quietly. "And if Rusk comes by tonight, you haven't seen me since this afternoon." Martha looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Her hands were not shaking, but they were gripping the edge of the counter. "Be careful," she said. "He knows this town better than you do." "I know," Steve said, "but I know things about machines that he doesn't." The motor court room was small and plain green bedspread, one lamp, a window that looked out over the gravel lot and the road beyond it. Steve had been reading Walt's letter for 20 minutes when headlights swept across the window from outside. He folded the letter, set it under the pillow, and sat up. The headlights died. A car door opened and closed. Footsteps on gravel. Slow, deliberate, not trying to be quiet. Then, a knock. 3 times. The kind of knock that is polite on the surface and something else underneath. Steve opened the door. Calvin Rusk stood in the yellow light from the parking lot lamp, hat in hand, in the particular posture of a man making a social call that both parties understand is not a social call. "Hope I'm not interrupting," Rusk said. "You are," Steve said. He did not open the door wider. Rusk smiled the way he always smiled, reaching the mouth, stopping there. "I wanted to make sure you were settled in all right. Ridge Hollow isn't much, but the motor court's comfortable enough." He glanced past Steve into the room, just a glance, quick, taking inventory. "Saw your bike in the lot when I was making my evening rounds." "It's a small town," Steve said. "I figured you'd know where I was." "That's the thing about a town like this," Rusk said. He was not looking at Steve now. He was looking at the road. Relaxed. Casual. A man who has all the time in the world. Everybody knows everybody. Everybody knows what everyone's business is. It's mostly a comfort. A pause. Mostly. He let that word sit in the air between them. "I just want to make sure you understand something," Rusk continued, still looking at the road. "Walt Maddox was a man this town respected. His grief was real, and nobody here dismisses it. But there are people in Ridge Hollow who spent a long time watching Walt chase something that wasn't there. It hurt them to watch. They don't want to go through that again." He turned and looked at Steve directly. "Especially not because a stranger passed through and decided, in a day and a half, that he understood something the people who lived here couldn't figure out in 11 years. He said it pleasantly. Not a threat. Just a statement of position, delivered with the authority of a man who has held that position for a very long time and does not expect to be dislodged from it by a guest." Steve held his gaze. "Is there anything else?" Rusk put his hat back on. "Get some rest," he said. "Road's rough if you're tired." He turned and walked back to the cruiser, unhurried, the gravel crunching evenly under his boots. Steve watched the taillights until they rounded the bend. Then he went back inside, retrieved the letter from under the pillow, and finished reading it. Whatever Rusk was afraid of was in that headlight. And now Steve knew why Thursday was not an accident. Steve lay on top of the blankets with the lamp on and read Walt Maddox's letter to the end. He read it once through, straight, then he started over from the beginning. Walt had written it several years before his death. The handwriting was deliberate and slightly unsteady, the penmanship of a man who knew his hands were starting to go and was fighting to get the truth down while the details were still reliable. It was not polished writing. It was honest writing, which is harder. This is what it said. In the autumn of 1957, Daniel Kerrigan was working for a government logistics contractor that managed surplus military equipment in the Central Valley. He was careful and thorough, kept his own copies of manifests out of habit, double-checked figures at the end of each week. He was not suspicious by nature. He was precise. In September of that year, he found something wrong in the disposal records. Shipments of valuable military hardware, engine components, communications equipment, items worth real money were being logged as disposed of, written off as waste. But the disposal documentation had no location, no receiving agent, no method, just a date. And a signature, Daniel's signature, forged. Someone had been falsifying records in Daniel's name while routing the equipment to private buyers. If anyone ever audited the books, the paper trail led directly to Daniel. He was being built as the explanation, and he hadn't known it until he found it himself. He brought it to his supervisor, Gerald Pruitt. Pruitt told him to leave it alone. When Daniel pressed, Pruitt told him he didn't understand how these things worked and should be grateful he still had a job. Daniel could not leave it alone. He went to Calvin Rusk, then a young deputy, a man he had known since boyhood, a man he trusted. He showed Rusk the documents. He named his suspicions. He asked Rusk to investigate. Rusk told him he would handle it. 3 weeks later, a 23-year-old seasonal laborer named Bobby Hartley was found dead near Red Creek Reservoir. Bobby had driven one of the trucks on several of the fraudulent runs. He hadn't understood what he was transporting at first. By October, he had figured out enough to be dangerous. He had told a co-worker he was thinking of going to the authorities. His death was ruled accidental. Drowning. No investigation followed. Within days of Bobby's death, Calvin Rusk came to Daniel Kerrigan no longer as a friend, no longer as an investigator, but as something else entirely, and told him that the county inquiry had determined Daniel was personally responsible for the missing inventory. Formal charges were being prepared. He had 12 hours to make himself gone before the paperwork was filed. Daniel understood immediately what had happened. Rusk hadn't investigated. Rusk had closed the case from the inside. Whatever arrangement existed between the men running the scheme and the men who could expose it, Rusk was on the wrong side of it. Bobby Hartley was dead because he had been about to talk. Daniel Kerrigan was being driven out because he had already talked to the one man who had the power to use it against him. Daniel drove to Walt's house that night. He told Walt everything. He said he had spent 2 days making copies of the key documents, the shipping manifests, the falsified disposal records, and that he had obtained, from someone he trusted inside the depot, a photograph taken one night in September at the Red Creek transfer facility. 2 men loading wooden crates into an unmarked truck. One had his back turned. The other was caught partly in profile, his uniform clearly visible, his nameplate readable. Rusk. Daniel had hidden everything inside the headlight housing of the Hydroglide. He asked Walt to guard the machine. He said, "Keep it where everyone can see it. Don't hide it. Put it somewhere so obvious that nobody thinks to look inside. And wait for someone who can use what's in there." 2. Then he disappeared. Walt kept the motorcycle. For 11 years he kept it through the mockery, through the pity, through Rusk's casual management of his reputation as a harmless eccentric. He kept it while Calvin Rusk became sheriff, then a respected figure, then the kind of man whose word was accepted without question in every room in the county. And then Walt Maddox got sick, and his hands stopped working, and he ran out of time before the right person walked down Route 9. Steve set the letter on the nightstand. He stared at the water stain on the ceiling for a long time. He thought about Daniel Kerrigan being erased not by violence, but by paperwork, a forged signature, a closed investigation, a friend who had turned out not to be one. He thought about what it meant to spend 11 years somewhere under a false name, carrying a reputation you could not defend, knowing the proof of your innocence was inside a machine in a small California town and that there was no guarantee anyone would ever open it. He thought about Walt watching the sheriff shake hands at civic dinners while the man Walt was protecting rotted out of public memory as a traitor. And then he stopped thinking about Walt and Daniel because he realized he had started thinking about himself. Not the crime, nothing like that, but the other part. The part about being judged by a story someone else told about you. The part about carrying a public image that only partially resembled the person underneath it. The magazines called him the king of cool, detached, invulnerable, untouchable. They wrote the story they wanted, and he had learned to live inside it, and sometimes that was fine, and sometimes, alone on a back road in California, it felt like wearing a cage instead of a name. He understood, in a way he hadn't expected to understand, why Walt Maddox had never let go. Some things are worth waiting for, even when waiting costs you everything. He turned off the lamp. Steve was at the gas station before sunrise on Wednesday morning. He parked on the shoulder and stood outside the fence in the gray pre-dawn light, coffee from the motor court vending machine going cold in his hand, looking at the Hydra Glide. Something was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, just slightly. The front wheel was at a different angle than it had been the day before. He was certain of it. He had photographed the position in his mind, the way he photographed every machine he examined, automatically, without deciding to. The wheel had been turned slightly more to the left. Someone had moved the Harley during the night. Not taken it, the chain was still in place, the lock still secured, but someone had been close enough to touch it, to push or pull the front end, and then had left it shifted just enough to notice if you were paying the kind of attention Steve was paying. He crouched beside the fence and looked at the gravel shoulder. Boot prints, 2 sets, from the same direction, overlapping on the way back. Someone had come, stood near the fence for a while long enough to leave a compressed depression in the gravel, and then gone the same way they had come. Not Ellis Stroud. Stroud walked in polished shoes, according to everything Steve had observed. These were wider soles, work boots, not a random passerby, someone who knew the machine well enough to want to check on it, or check for something. Steve stood up slowly, turning to look at the road. Empty in both directions. The boards on the gas station windows were intact, no one had broken in. The lock was untouched. Whoever had been here had not found what they were looking for, or they had confirmed that it was still there. He drove to Noah's garage. Noah was already under a truck, visible only from the waist down, when Steve crouched at the edge of the lift. Someone was at the Harley last night, Steve said. Noah rolled out from under the truck and sat up. His face went still. Rusk? I don't know, but someone moved the front wheel, and there are boot prints on the shoulder. Steve kept his voice low. Does anyone else know what's supposed to be inside that headlight? Besides you, Martha, and whoever Walt told before he died. Noah wiped his hands on a rag, thinking. There was a man, he said slowly. Earl Pickett, old friend of Walt's from the Korean years. He came through about 3 months ago. Said he'd heard Walt was gone. He and I talked for a while. I mentioned what Walt had told me about the headlight. I didn't think it mattered. He looked at Steve. I haven't seen Pickett since. But he was big. He wore work boots. Could he be connected to Rusk? I don't know, but Rusk knows everybody in this county. Noah set down the rag. If someone tipped Rusk that you were asking questions yesterday, then Rusk sent someone to check whether the evidence was still in place, Steve said. Which means he knows it might be real. They both understood what that meant. The junk hauler was scheduled for Thursday morning. That was not a random date. That was a deadline. We have today, Steve said. One day, the Valley Courier was a narrow storefront on Main, squeezed between a hardware store and a laundromat, with last week's front page taped to the inside of the window. Grace Alderman was at the layout table when Steve and Noah walked in. She looked up from a paste-up board and assessed them both in about 3 seconds. Steve told her who he was. I know who you are, she said. She did not reach for the phone or the notepad. That was a good sign. He gave her Walt's letter. She read it standing up, one hand resting on the layout table, not shifting her weight once. When she finished, she read the last 2 pages over. Then she set it down. I tried to dig into this when Walt died, she said. I had 3 sources who told me off the record that Rusk had pressured the investigation in 1957. Nothing I could print. When I kept asking around, Rusk came to see me personally. She paused. He was very polite. He told me the story about Walt had already been told, and there was nothing new in it. He mentioned, just in passing, that the county's legal notices account, which the Courier depends on, was up for renewal. He said he hoped we'd have a long and productive relationship. He threatened your advertising revenue, Noah said. He expressed a hope, Grace said flatly. In the way people who have power over you express hopes. Then her voice dropped. I want to be honest with you about something. When Rusk came to see me, when he mentioned the county advertising account, I told myself I was being strategic, that I was protecting the paper so it could fight another day. She shook her head slightly. That's not what I was doing. I was scared. He didn't threaten me directly. He never does. He just made sure I understood what I could lose, and I folded. She looked at the manila folder on her desk. I've been living with that for 8 months. I kept every note. 2. I kept the camera loaded, but I didn't move, because I was afraid. She looked back up at Steve. I'm not going to make that same choice again. She reached under the desk and brought out the camera 35 millimeters, strap-worn smooth with use that had been kept close and ready for exactly this moment. She had never stopped investigating. She had just been waiting for someone with enough weight behind them to make the risk survivable. They went at noon. Steve, Grace, Noah, and Martha, who had turned the diner sign to closed for only the second time anyone could remember. Ellis Stroud was already at the property with a man from the junk hauling company, clipboard in hand, walking the perimeter. He saw them coming and put himself between them and the gate. Properties posted, he said. No access. Mr. Stroud, Steve said, I'd like to buy that motorcycle. Stroud looked at the Harley the way he looked at everything in terms of what it could yield. Junk haulers got it tomorrow. I'll pay cash today. $300. Stroud did the calculation in about 4 seconds. $30 from the hauler versus $300 in hand. He reached out and shook. Grace photographed the bill of sale handwritten on the back of Stroud's clipboard notepad, signed and dated. She photographed Steve holding the key to the padlock. She photographed the chain falling free when the lock opened. The Harley stood unchained for the first time in 11 years. Noah was beside it before the chain hit the ground. His hands went to the headlight ring with the assurance of someone who had been rehearsing this in his mind for years, reading the gaps, the missing screw, the 3 that were seated wrong. Here, he said. Just that word. He had his tools, a mechanic's folding set, always in his jacket. The retaining ring came off in under 2 minutes. The sealed beam unit came with it, and behind the reflector in the small dry cavity of the cast-iron housing there was a bundle. Flannel cloth, once part of a shirt, wrapped around something and secured with electrical tape that had yellowed and gone brittle over 11 years. But the California air was dry, and the housing had been sealed, and whatever Daniel Kerrigan had hidden inside had been protected better than anyone had a right to expect. Noah handed it to Steve. For a moment, nobody breathed. Steve unrolled the cloth slowly on the concrete beside the motorcycle's front wheel, in full afternoon sun, where Grace's camera could record every detail. There was an envelope inside, personal size, sealed with wax. Alongside it, a small brass key with a military serial number stamped on the bow, and beneath both, folded once, a photograph printed on thick 1950s paper stock. The envelope first, the wax seal cracked away in pieces. Inside, 3 documents, shipping manifests, from the Red Creek Logistics Depot, dated September and October of 1957. Inventory logged as disposed of. Beside each entry, Daniel's forged signature, and alongside them, in Daniel's handwriting, a careful annotation of every discrepancy, the actual inventory numbers, the actual dates, the actual names. 11 years old. Still readable. Then the photograph. 2 men at night, at the Red Creek Transfer Depot, loading wooden crates into an unmarked truck. One had his back to the camera. The other was partly turned, caught in the act of looking toward the loading dock, his profile visible, his uniform visible, and most importantly, his nameplate visible. Rusk. Grace's shutter clicked once, twice, 3 times. Silence. Then Martha, who had been standing perfectly still behind them throughout, made a sound that was not quite a word and not quite a cry. She pressed her hand over her mouth. Noah crouched back on his heels and looked at the photograph for a long moment. He was right, he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. Walt was right the whole time. By 2 o'clock, word had moved through Ridge Hollow the way it only can in a town of 1,200 without announcement, without a single clear origin, carried along by the invisible current that runs between people who have been sharing the same square mile for years. Something was happening at the old gas station. People came the way they come to fires, not because they planned to, but because something in the air told them they needed to be there. There were more than 40 of them when Calvin Rusk's cruiser came around the North Bend. He got out slowly. He read the crowd the way he had read every room in this county for 11 years, quickly, quietly, looking for the fault lines, calculating where the weight was. He saw Martha holding something against her chest. He saw Noah beside the unchained Harley. He saw Grace Alderman with a camera around her neck, already turned at the right angle. And then he saw Steve McQueen standing in the middle of it all, holding a photograph. Rusk's composure did not crack. That was the thing about him even now. Standing in front of 40 people who were looking at him differently than they had ever looked at him before, the face stayed controlled, calm. The calm of a man who has practiced controlling his expression in difficult situations for a very long time. He walked toward Steve, not fast, not aggressive, just measured. "Mr. McQueen," he said, "I want to be clear about something. Whatever you believe you found in that machine, you are on private property and in the middle of something you don't fully understand." "I'm standing on property I purchased legally from Ellis Stroud," Steve said. "The bill of sale is in Grace Alderman's jacket pocket. The documents I found inside this headlight are currently being photographed and transmitted to contacts in Fresno who are outside your jurisdiction." Rusk looked at the photograph in Steve's hand. His eyes stayed on it for 2 or 3 seconds, long enough for everyone watching to see that he recognized it. "I want to tell everyone here," Steve said, not loudly, not like a man making a speech, just clearly what Daniel Kerrigan hid inside this headlight in 1957 and why he ran. He did not shout. He did not need to. The road was quiet, the crowd was close, and some truths carry their own weight without amplification. He told them about the stolen inventory, the forged signatures, the falsified disposal records. Bobby Hartley, 23 years old, dead near Red Creek, ruled accidental, never reinvestigated. And Calvin Rusk, then a deputy, who had taken the information Daniel brought to him and used it not to investigate a crime but to bury one and to bury the man who had reported it. He held up the photograph. "The nameplate reads Rusk," he said. "This is the Red Creek Transfer Depot. The date, based on the documents found with this photograph, is September 1957. The crowd was completely silent. Rusk let the silence hold for a beat. Then he turned to the crowd, not to Steve, to the crowd, and when he spoke, his voice was steady and his tone was almost gentle. The tone of a man who has been in difficult rooms before and knows how to use familiarity as a weapon. "I want you all to think about something," he said. "This man has been in Ridge Hollow for 2 days. 2 days. You have known me for 11 years. You have seen me at your tables, at your kids' graduations, at your father's funerals." He let that land. "And now a Hollywood actor, a stranger, shows up with papers he claims he found in a headlight, and you're going to take his word over mine?" A few people in the crowd shifted. Not many, but enough for Rusk to see it. He turned back to Steve. His eyes were calm, but the calculation behind them was running hard. "Those documents," Rusk said, "could have been put inside that machine at any time. By Walt, by this boy, by anyone with an interest in making a story out of nothing. Chain of custody, isn't that what they call it? There is none." Steve reached into the cloth bundle and held up the sealed envelope, the original wax seal, cracked and yellow, still attached to the torn flap. "The wax seal on this envelope is 11 years old," he said quietly. "The documents inside are typed on a machine that matches the make used at the Red Creek Depot in 1957. Grace Alderman's contact in Fresno confirmed the typeface this morning." He looked at Rusk. "And the handwriting on the annotations is Daniel Kerrigan's. Which you would know, Sheriff, because you saw his handwriting on the manifests you reviewed in 1957, the ones you told Daniel you'd investigate and then buried." He turned back to the crowd. "Daniel Kerrigan wrote these documents before he ran. He hid them inside a motorcycle because he knew the man he'd trusted with the truth had already chosen the other side. Walt Maddox guarded that motorcycle for 11 years, not because he was crazy, not because he couldn't grieve, but because he was the only person in this town who understood that silence is not the same as innocence." Nobody moved. Rusk looked at the photograph one final time. He looked at the crowd, at faces he had known for decades, faces that were now looking back at him with an expression he had never seen on them before. Not hostility, not certainty, doubt. The quiet, irreversible kind that arrives when the story you have accepted stops holding its shape. Rusk put on his hat. He turned and walked back to the cruiser without another word. His footsteps were even. His shoulders were level. He was not a man who ran, but he was also, for the first time in 11 years, a man who had run out of room. He drove toward his office, because that was where men go when they need to call a lawyer. Martha let out a long, slow breath. She was holding the photograph from Walt's tin box, the two young men in 1952, before everything went wrong, and she was shaking very slightly. "He was never crazy," she said. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Walt was never crazy. He was just the only one who kept his eyes open." The days that followed moved with the momentum of a long-stopped clock finally set right. Grace Alderman's contacts in Fresno included a former investigative reporter who had spent 4 years building sources inside the Central Valley's county government. What Steve had found in the headlight gave him not a hint or a rumor, but evidence dated, original, specific, the kind of evidence that does not need interpretation, the kind that speaks for itself. The story ran in 3 papers within a week. The county board placed Calvin Rusk on administrative leave within 10 days. He hired a lawyer. The authority he had spent 11 years building carefully on the foundation of a single buried lie was now being examined by people who had not been present when the lie was made and owed him nothing. The investigation into Bobby Hartley's death, ruled accidental in 1957, never questioned since, was formally reopened. His mother, 81 years old, was told by letter that the county had determined further examination was warranted. She read the letter at her kitchen table in Modesto and didn't speak for a long time. Then she said to her daughter, "I always knew it wasn't an accident. 30 years I've known." Grace Alderman published a piece in the Courier picked up by the Fresno Bee that ended with a single paragraph addressed directly to Daniel Kerrigan, wherever he was. "The motorcycle is free. Walt kept his promise. The truth has been told. You can come home." Whether Daniel Kerrigan ever read those words would take time to learn. Men who disappear under the weight of a false accusation do not always come back simply because the accusation has been named. But the door was open now, and it would not close again. Steve McQueen spent his last 2 days in Ridge Hollow quietly. He drank coffee with Martha each morning and let her talk about Walt without redirecting her or trying to summarize the grief. He spent time at Fitch's garage with Noah, asking real questions about carburetor rebuild sequences and listening to the answers with genuine attention. He called his attorney in Los Angeles and arranged for copies of the documents to be held in professional custody at the state level, a safeguard, in case Rusk's lawyers tried to challenge the chain of custody on the originals. On his last morning, he called a motorcycle restoration specialist in Ventura named Ed Fallon. 63 years old, soft-spoken, the kind of craftsman who understood that some machines were worth restoring exactly for what they were, not what they could become. Fallon arrived with a panel truck and a padded ramp. He walked around the Hydroglide once, slowly, without touching it. Then he looked at Steve. "What do you want done?" "Mechanically perfect," Steve said. "Replace everything that has to be replaced. Leave everything else where it is." He put his hand on the tank. "Don't repaint it. Don't rechrome anything for appearances. Leave the marks. Leave the rust where it is. Leave the cracks in the leather." Fallon nodded the way a craftsman nods when he has been given instructions that match his own understanding of how things should be. 3 weeks, he said. "Maybe 4. Take the time it needs." Steve counted out what Fallon asked, plus enough to cover the unexpected. Then he turned to Noah, who had appeared at the edge of the lot, as he always appeared, on his bicycle, watching carefully. "When Fallon brings it back," Steve said, "I want you to be the one who starts it." Noah looked at him. "Why me?" "Because Walt told you to wait for someone. And you did. For 2 years, every morning, you walked past that fence and didn't give up." Steve looked at him steadily. "Walt can't be here. But the next best thing is someone who believed in him when nobody else did." Noah looked at the Hydroglide. His jaw was tight. He nodded once. He didn't trust his voice. 3 weeks later, on a Thursday morning that could not have been more different from the Thursday everyone had feared, Ed Fallon's white panel truck came back to Ridge Hollow. Perhaps 60 people gathered at the old gas station without anyone organizing them. They simply appeared, drawn by the kind of collective knowledge that moves through small towns without a telephone or a notice board. Grace Alderman was there with her camera. Martha wore a dress she had pressed the night before, the first time she had dressed for an occasion in months. Ellis Stroud stood at the back of the crowd, separate and uncertain, in the position of a man who has recently understood he was used, and who has not yet decided how he feels about having chosen not to ask questions. Fallon and his assistants unloaded the Hydroglide down the padded ramp. The machine looked exactly as it had looked, the same worn paint, the same patina on the chrome, the same cracked leather seat, the same missing mirror. Fallon had done exactly what Steve asked, rebuilt it from the inside, left the outside alone. All the evidence of 11 years of weather and waiting was intact, because that was not damage. That was testimony. Above the headlight housing, bolted to the original bracket where the old placard had been, there was a new one. Metal, letters stamped in. For Walt Maddox and Daniel Kerrigan. Some promises outlive silence. The crowd read it. Nobody spoke. Noah Whitlock stepped forward. He put one hand on the dark green tank, the tank that Martha had wiped clean every week for 8 months with an oilcloth, keeping a dead man's promise while not having the courage to do more, the guilt of which she would carry and slowly put down for the rest of her life. He felt the metal under his palm. Then he found the choke. He found the throttle. He put his foot on the kickstarter and pressed down once, his full weight behind it. The engine turned, did not catch. He pressed again. Still no catch. The crowd did not make a sound. 60 people holding their breath beside an old gas station on Route 9 inches Ridge Hollow, California, in the summer of 1968. On the third kick, the Hydroglide woke up. The sound was old and deep, and absolutely certain the sound of a machine that has been patient for a very long time and is finally, without apology, doing what it was made to do. It filled the morning air completely, the way a sound fills a space that has been too quiet for too long. Nobody clapped. Not at first. They just listened. In that crowd were people who had driven past that fence for 11 years, telling themselves the chained motorcycle was the product of a grieving old man's delusion. Those people were very still, now not with the stillness of embarrassment, but with something heavier. The stillness of people who understand, for the first time, the cost of believing what authority tells them without asking why. And there were people fewer, but there who had always felt something was wrong about the official version of Walt Maddox. Those people were not triumphant. They were just watching Noah Whitlock hold the throttle steady, feeling the engine's vibration travel up through the bars and into his arms and his chest. With the quiet expression of someone receiving something they had been waiting a long time for, Martha stood at the edge of the crowd and held the photograph from Walt's tin box, the one of 2 young men, 1952, before everything went wrong. She held it with both hands, the way you hold something you are finally returning to its rightful place. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at the machine and at the boy on it. "You can go now," she said, very quietly, to Walt, to Daniel, to the promise that had outlasted the fear and the rust and the silence and 11 years of being called nothing. 200 miles west, on a coastal highway with the Pacific flashing through breaks in the hills, Steve McQueen rode without a destination and without looking back. He found a pull-off on the shoulder gravel, dry grass, the sound of the ocean below the ridge, and stopped the engine. He sat there without getting off. In his jacket pocket was the photograph. Walt and Danny, 1952. He had kept the original. He was not ready to let it go. He held it up in the afternoon light. The man laughing at something outside the frame. The man looking directly into the camera with the eyes of someone making a vow. Walt had kept that vow for 11 years, in a small town that called him crazy, in front of a sheriff who counted on indifference to protect him. He had kept it until his body gave out, and even then had arranged for the key to be waiting in a tin box in a diner for whoever asked the right questions. Steve had not cried in a long time. He was not going to start here, but his eyes were not dry, and he sat with that for a moment without trying to fix it. Some men are judged by a story someone else wrote about them and never get to correct it. Some men keep faith with the erased year after year, in the dark, with no audience and no guarantee it will ever matter. And sometimes, if the right person stops at the right moment on the right road, the machine speaks, the lock opens, and the truth comes out of a headlight housing where it has been waiting 11 years in the California sun, patient as iron, true as a promise. He put the photograph back in his pocket. He started the engine. He rode on.